Welcome back team, today we're going to be going through my complete guide to counterpicking in top lane. We'll be going through literally every single top lane champion one by one, and breaking down some recommended counterpicks, but also some tips and strategies to keep in mind when you're playing up against them, just in case you can't play the counters. So if you've ever found yourself struggling into certain champions like maybe Illaoi or Heimerdinger, I know everyone loves playing up against them, then this video will be perfect for you. Real quick before we start the video, I'm back to streaming educational content 5 days a week on Twitch. I know it's been some time now, I appreciate your patience, but we're back to work, so the link will be in the description. I hope to see you there. Now, we're going to be going through every champion one by one, roughly in order of pick rate, but it will all be timestamped down below. And one thing to keep in mind is I'm not just going to give the quote-unquote best counter picks possible answer if the champions are unpopular. So for example, if we're up against a Garen, I'm not going to say you should pick Heimerdinger or Varus. These are loser champs that top laners don't really like to play. I'm going to try to give as much variety as possible, unless there's just no good answers to them, and you might have to dip into those sort of more niche counter picks. But starting with Garen, you have quite a few options. The best answers to him are going to be champions like Darius, Ambessa, or Camille, where these champions have full control of the lane for the most part, but they also outscale him inside as well. Unless you get behind on these three champions, it's very rare that Garen can just beat you up inside lane. Granted, he's not ahead of you, so champions that can win the lane up against him, but also beat him inside lane, are going to be your best bet. Now, you do have some other alternative champions like Gnar are quite good. Of course, range top lane bullies that also beat him inside lane, where a champion like Kennen, to compare it to Gnar, you will win the lane, but you don't outscale him inside. He can beat you inside lane, he can keep you pinned down. Granted, you don't get a massive lead, but a champion like Gnar can do both, so you can see the formula. A champion that can beat him up in lane, but also outscale him inside is going to be your goal. Moving on to Darius. Now you have two options playing up against this champion. First are champions that can lower his HP bar without taking much damage in response, so champions like Jayce, Aurora, or Gnar. It's very easy to chip away at him, because the thing about Darius is he loves extended trades. He needs to trade to go for a long time so he can get 5 stacks and run you down, but champions that can lower his HP bar without being able to get hits in response and can disengage him if he tries to force. So you notice Jayce, Aurora, Gnar, they all have disengage as well. Jayce Hammer E, Aurora has 2 disengage ones, Gnar can hop away, so really hard for Darius to do what he wants to do up against these champions. The other option is a champion like Volibear, because you need to be able to burst him if the fight goes in time before the fight goes long enough. So champs that have enough upfront burst that can kill him before he gets 5 stacks and before he can run you down, like an Ignite Volibear, Ignite Sett, champions like that, they also work very well. So keep in mind, a big mistake I see when people play up against Darius is they probably lost to him in the past, and now they play respectful. It's really important that you're not afraid to trade into Darius. You want to be aiming to take 100 to 0 trades, so chip his HP bar down, stay high yourself, so that when you do go for the all-in, the fight doesn't last long enough for him to really ramp up and get his passive and conquer it going. So no matter what champion you're playing, aim for short trades, get him lower and lower, take Ignite if you can on a champion like Camille, you can take DP Ignite, even on a champion like Olaf, you can take Ignite in this matchup, and really try to burst him before the fight goes for too long. Now for Mordekaiser, you have two options playing up against him. Champions that can easily space his abilities, like an Ambessa, where it's very difficult for Mord to get his value down if he can't stack up his passive, because you can kite him out, or dodge his abilities from pre-dodging with your dashes, really hard for him to be useful. Or champions that can just straight up beat him in the all-in, so Olaf is my favorite counter to him, as if you ulti before he ults, he's not going to be able to put you in the death realm. You used to be able to cleanse it with your ulti, you can't anymore, so make sure you ulti a little bit early, but really hard for Mord to beat a good Olaf player. Now Warwick is another option as well. Champions that build Blade of the Ruin King are really good into him, so Warwick you can rush Bork, Lethal Tempo Barrier you can just straight up beat the Mordekaiser down, really hard for him to do anything in that matchup as well. One more option in case you like to play these types of champions, Cassiopeia also does well, as you have really high movement speed, spacing ability on his spells, and also you can win the all-in with a Conqueror Cassio. Now, some tips for playing up against Mordekaiser, regardless of your champion. Baiting spells is the #1 thing. He's always going to try to use EQ or just Q when you walk towards him or when you walk towards a creep. So keeping that in mind, you can bait it out. Walk towards that caster minion and dodge at the last second. You might lose 14 gold, but now his spells are on cooldown and you might be able to force onto him. You might Garen combo, Jax combo, doesn't matter. When he wastes an ability and you already pre-dodge it and get out of the way, really hard for him to beat you in that trade. Also, ending the trade in CC is a really important skill set as well up against a Mord. So what I mean by that is, let's imagine you jump on their head as Jax, Q auto W with your E up, stun him, and you're already leaving. If you stun him and go for that one extra greedy auto attack, the stun duration expires, and then he can EQ auto you or just fight you, he's going to win. Mordekaiser is quite good at short trades, but very good at extended trades, so try to end the trade in CC if you can. Now for Sett. The thing about Sett is he's a really powerful melee champion, but he's extremely short range and has no mobility. So anything that can keep distance up against him is going to be very favored. So Gnar, Ken, and Aurora, of course, these range top lane counter picks are going to be your best bet. It's pretty unplayable for a Sett to play up against a good range top player, granted your spacing is good enough. Now, a melee option would be a champion like Ambessa, where you're pretty much range, you have a lot of range abilities, extended auto range, so you can bait out a Z and poke him from far away and then go in for the burst later on. If you fight a Sett from full HP versus full HP, you're probably going to lose most of the time, so it's similar to Darius in the way, where you want to keep your distance, poke him down, and then go in later on. You can try to bait a Z out as well, no matter what champion you're playing, pretend to walk towards him, pretend to go for a creep, step backwards, bait him to use E, and making sure no matter what, you're already pre-dodging his W. As long as you don't get hit by the center part of W, you're going to be fine most of the time, so make sure you're very aware of a minion being behind him to not get stunned. If he can just EU, the E slow, it's not a big deal, but EW, of course, unavoidable true damage, so really important that you approach it slowly, try to bait out his abilities, and make sure you're always pre-dodging his W. Now, for Aatrox, the best types of champions to play up against him are ones that can force onto him and punish his weak early game. Aatrox is quite weak 1 to 4, but around 5 to 9 he starts to really pick up in the lane, so if you can punish him before that on a champion like Riven, Irelia, or Fiora, that is going to be your best bet. Ignite also works extremely well up against him. It is optional, but on a champion like Riven, you should for sure take it. Fiora, Irelia more optional, but still going to be really good for you if you can run it in that lane. Some other options are, of course, champs that can dodge his abilities very easily and poke him down from range, like an Aurora, but I would say this would require really high execution. It's actually a little bit easier for the Aatrox to play up against her. In most cases, unless the Aurora is really good, then there's not much the Aatrox can do at all. So if you have high execution, a champion like Aurora or Kennen can work well, but most of the time, these strong divers like Riven or Irelia are going to be the best bet. Now, very similar to Mordekaiser, the number one rule playing up against an Aatrox is baiting spells. Pretend to walk towards the minion, click away, walk towards him, dodge at the last second, pre-dodge his Q, anticipate that it's coming out ahead of time, and dodge it before you even see the animation. Now, if you jump onto his head on a champion like Jax or something like that, making sure his Q3, the center part of Q3, is the number one thing you're trying to dodge. It's really hard for him to hit Q1 or Q2 sweet spot if you directly jump onto his head on a champion like Camille or a champion like Jax. But Q3, you have to be extremely careful. So my advice for that is pretend to go a certain way. So maybe you run through him trying to block off his escape to tower, but then dodge at the last second, run back through him and dodge his center part Q3 at the last second, because if you force onto him and only get hit by the outer ring of Q3, most of the time you're going to win that trade. Moving on to Teemo, and the most annoying part about this champion is the fact that a lot of top laners are completely neutralized by his blind ability, where champions that don't really get affected by it that much are going to be your best picks into him. So champions like Pantheon, champions like Jayce, mainly spell-based champs, or even a tanky champ like Zac does quite well, or Cassiopeia or a Gragas, you can see the theme here, champs that don't really get affected by the blind. Now, the advice for playing up against him, the way Teemo wants to play the lane, is to stay high HP himself and chip away at you lower and lower. Pre-6, he doesn't really have any meaningful wave clear and no sustain at all. So if you can take any type of good trade into him, where he gets low, really hard for him to play out the lane. Now, a lot of champs might not have that option, but if you punish his mistake, if he has bad spacing, you can definitely look for it. Now, another tip to keep in mind is leverage your TP. So if you're playing Teleport versus Ignite, where if you're playing most champions up against a Teemo, you're probably going to take TP. You want to find a situation where you just kill a wave, even if it's under your tower, just killing the wave before cannon, basing and TPing back. Now you're going to have full HP, full mana, and an item advantage, extra potions. That's when you can play it out. The fact that Teemo won't take TP most of the time is going to be an avenue for you to get a lead up against him. Really hard for a Teemo to get a base off if he's in a weaker position. He has no wave clear, doesn't have TP, doesn't have any sustain, so if you can find a way to become stronger than him, due to leveraging your TP to gain an advantage, you're going to be in a really good position. Another bit of advice for the 1 to 3 specifically, I see a lot of people take way too much damage, level 1 and 2, so that when you do get level 3, you're not strong enough to all-in him. A lot of top lane bruiser champions can beat Teemo in a level 3 all-in, but if you get too low before that moment, you're not going to have the opportunity. So make sure you leverage bushes really well, just come in and out of the bush getting farm as much as you can, and make sure you're playing for the bounce back. When your wave is bouncing back towards him, and you get level 3 with the minion advantage, that's going to be a really good opportunity for you to go in. Now, for Yone, the best champions to play up against a Yone player are champions that can force onto him really hard if he tries to walk up to farm or stack his Q. So champions like Renekton, champions like Pantheon or Riven, they have a lot of hard CC and they can force onto him with their gap closes if he ever tries to walk up. Yone with Blade of the Ruin King and Lethal Tempo is pretty unbeatable for a lot of champions, so you want to be trying to punish him early game and set him really far behind. These champions also have hard CC, so you can mark him in a team fight, watch him with your mind, and if he ever goes in, you can just stun him straight away, and it's really easy to blow him up as he is quite a squishy full damage champion also. Another option for a counter pick is a champion like Jax, where the lane is nowhere near as good, but it's more of a full game counter, where the problem with a counter pick like Pantheon is even though you can win the matchup, if he gets a lot of jungle help or you just don't play that well and don't win the lane, you're going to get destroyed in side lane. Where a champion like Jax, you can win the matchup and win the side lane as well, so that can feel a little bit nicer overall. Next up we have Jax, and secretly I hope nobody watches this timestamp as I don't want to face these champions anymore, but champions like Aurora, Kennen, or Gragas, so champs with good poke and disengage, are going to be the best approach to Jax. It doesn't really matter what champ you pick into him, if you have poke and disengage, a lot of the time you're going to be very favored for that matchup. So some other alternatives would be champions like Malphite, champions like Poppy, you can poke him down and disengage him quite easily if he tries to force onto. Something about Malphite specifically as well is you can buffer the W through Jax's E if you time it well. Same with abilities like Camille Q2, stuff like that. So a lot of people just accept that you can't touch him during his E animation, but there are certain spells, enhanced auto attacks, that actually can be buffered through the E if you time it perfectly. Now, the issue with Jax is always going to be the fact that he has quite poor wave clear, unless he can leverage his E and hit you at the same time, and he has very poor sustain. So champions that can poke him, and the only option he has is to fight it out by jumping onto your head, and you can disengage it. So Kennen stun, Gragas E, Aurora dashes, stuff like that, make it pretty much unplayable for him to win the matchup. Now, granted, you do have to play it a little bit better than him. If you're playing the champion like Aurora or Kennen, the onus is on you. The execution is on you. Of course, there are some things that Jax can do well, but some advice is not wasting your major abilities or walking up when they're down. So imagining you just Gragas eat him because he put his E up, but he still has his Q, you need to play a little bit respectful. You need to chill and wait for your E to come back up before you approach, or he can jump on your head and bash you down. Same with Kennen. If you waste your E or you even throw out your Q and you're not going to be able to stun him in a hurry, you have to play very different when your main disengage ability is on cooldown there. So to give an easy example, an ease of execution counter would be a champion like Garen, where if he jumps onto your head, you put your W up to block his stun, you're probably going to win the trade if you WE. Now your W cooldown is longer than Jax's E, so if you gave him a timer to fight you with his E, where your W is still down, you're probably going to lose that trade. So making sure no matter what, you're playing around your main disengage abilities, and if you can do that and just chip away at the Jax with your poking tools, you're going to be fine most of the time. Next we have Cho'gath. Now with Chogs, a lot of champions will beat him in lane if he takes the grass page. With Halo Blades he is quite strong, but there are still some champions that can beat him regardless of his setup. So the champions you want to play are going to be champs like Gwen, Darius, or Yone, where not only is the lane extremely favored for you, but you also outscale and beat him in side lane as well. You don't want to be in the situation where you slightly win the lane on a champ like Renekton and then he just outscales you and there's not much you can do later on. He just becomes a complete scaling monster. So champs that can beat him in both, outscale him inside and win the lane. So either way, even if you don't kill him a few times, you're still going to scale for free. That's going to be your best approach. Another option would be a champion like Ambessa, where it's pretty much impossible for Cho'gath to hit his abilities onto a good Ambessa player. You can really dominate him in the lane, and even though you don't scale as hard in side lane as the champions above, still a good option as well. Now, something to keep in mind when playing up against a Cho'gath, a lot of people try to react to the Q circle animation and dodge it, but Cho'gath actually does a little stomp. You need to be reacting to the stomp he does, because the stomp will showcase before his Q. So you'll see him start the stomp animation, you already pre-dodge. If you're walking towards him and he Q'd, he's probably going to be trying to cut off your approach, so you can click backwards in that situation. Just dodge on the opposite direction of where you're going when he does the little stomp. If he adapts and he gets creative and he predicts your juke, he deserves to hit the Q, but most of the time that's not going to be the case. So just react to Cho'gath's Q, and make sure you're trying to let the wave come back to you. If Cho'gath can farm the wave for free under tower, he has really good sustain from his passive, so if you crash wave 4, wave 3 doesn't matter on a champion like Darius and let it come in, you need room to run him down and punish him. Now for Malphite, of course the best counterpick to a Malphite player is going to be Sylas, but everyone knows that. Let's assume Malphite has half a brain and he bans Sylas before blind picking it. Your best bets are going to be champions like Cho'gath or champions like Zac, who can out-sustain him and blow up the tower in front of him. You can just tank his damage. Malphite has some of the worst sustain in top lane. He has horrible mana costs, and he has no HP regen, so you can just ignore his damage with a bit of MR and start to blow up the tower 5 minutes onwards. Another option would be a champion like Dr.Mundo, who can't really force as hard as Cho'gath or Zac, but same approach, you just tank his damage with D-Shield, Second Wind, bit of health, and then run up and start headbutting his tower from under him. If you can blow up the tower in front of a Malphite player, that should be your goal most of the time, instead of tunneling too hard on killing him. Now you can play for an advantage 1-4, 1-5 before the tower armor drops at 5 minutes, try to kill him before he gets ulti or any resistances, but most of the time, I'd say in this season, especially, it's a bit harder to let the wave bounce back to you. Trying to blow up his tower is going to be the approach. Now, if you're playing a champ that can't really do that, your options are either going to be to proxy and attack the map, invade jungle, attack the enemy jungler or the enemy mid, try to spread your lead around the map with your prio, or just keep him stuck under tower and keep roaming. Sometimes you're not going to be able to get a massive lead up against a Malphite if you're playing a champ like Jax or a champion like Fiora. He can just neutralize you in a way until later on, but you're also going to scale for free. Don't try too hard to shit on the Malphite and set him behind anything like that, especially later on level 6 to 9. It's going to make you very vulnerable to a gank if you do that. Play for great CS, play for proxying if you can, play for roaming, playing for grubs. Try to spread your lead and your priority around the map instead. Now for Yorick, the champions you want to play up against him are champs that can punish his early game. He's one of the weaker champs in the game levels 1 to 5, so champions that can win the all-in and also outplay his ability, so Irelia is a great one. You can just one-shot all his little goblin things, champs like Wukong or Gwen, multiple gap closes or outplay potential on his W or E. Really easy for you to win the all-in up against him, granted you use your abilities well. Now another option for a counter pick is going to be a champion like Cho'gath, where not tank Cho'gath that's going to get wrecked. The Halo Blade's movement speed Cho, not only can you annihilate him early game, but when you get your Swifty boots and build towards your Shurelya's, so much movement speed is a lot easier for you to play out the lane, and you have so much poke as well. His sustain is quite low, so quite easy for you to punish him in that matchup. You can also just eat his mum when he summons Maiden at level 6, so that's going to be a good answer for you. Now some advice for playing up against Yorick is of course trying to pre-dodge his E, because E is pretty fast, pretty hard to dodge I'd say, unless you utilize a gap closer or a Gwen W, something like that. But especially if you're playing in a mobile champion like let's say Mordekaiser, try to pre-dodge. Click towards the minion, dodge at the last second, things of that nature. Try to pre-dodge his E, anticipate when he's going to use it. Most of the time that's going to be when you run at him or when you go for a minion. Now, champions that can win the lane early game, but can't really play for that all-in, are not going to be ideal, so little poking champs like Kennen can do fine, but they're not amazing. I'd always recommend champions where you can hard force onto them, so win trades and then all-in them as well, which is why the champions mentioned above, most of them are extremely good at all-in, and they have forcing tools. So if you find yourself playing a champion like Jax or Camille, where they're not as strong as those other champions, but you can still beat them, play aggressive, play extremely volatile, get pro, hard force level 1, try to abuse at level 2 vs 1, 3 vs 2, let the wave come back in. You need to try to get an advantage 1 to 5, play as aggressive as you can, within reason, don't just die to a gank for no reason, but play extremely aggressive, because if you don't, and he gets level 6 completely even, you're going to find yourself stuck under the tower the entire game. Moving on to Ambessa. Now, the thing about this champion is it is extremely broken at the moment, one of the strongest top laners in the game, but there are some champions where you can really stick onto her, and when they extend it all in, that makes it very difficult for her. So champions like Warwick, champs like Renekton or Irelia, especially these champions with Blade of the Ruin King, Warwick, Irelia, you can just completely catch her out inside and run her down in one shot. She does have a lot of mobility, but champions like that are really good at sticking onto her, so it can be really hard for her to play, and even in lane, these three champions can hard force onto her if she ever walks up. As long as you're playing around her gap closes, you're not just mindlessly getting hit by all of her Qs, you can hard force in these types of matchups. So these champs are going to be great into her, especially champs that have sustain, like all three of them do. Now another option, not quite as good, but a champion like Camille can do quite well, as you can force 1 to 3, 1 to 4 onto her, and then at level 9 and Triforce you win. The problem with that matchup is level 5 to 9, I would say. You lose, but you can win early game, you can win really hard at Triforce Spike, and again, it hits that criteria. You can destroy her in side lane if you're not behind, and champions like Yone as well aren't as good in lane, but same thing. As long as you can dominate her in side lane and you just keep outscaling her and outscaling her inside, these champions that can also win lane on top of that are going to be your best approach. Now, some advice when playing up against her W cooldown's extremely long, so good to look that up before you play, and try to play around that punish when her big shield's on cooldown, and a lot of people just mindlessly get hit by the Q1 and Q2, where Q2 is more easy to dodge than Q1, but Q1 range is quite short. So if you bait her out, if you pretend to run at her and then click backwards, bait her to use Q1, then she has to use Q2. She's going to walk towards you and go fishing for it, so if you dodge to the side or just all in her on that timer, when her Qs are down, she's not going to have as much mobility to disengage. Now, that does depend on your champion. If you're playing a champ like Garen, you're out of luck. You are just going to get kited around the place, unless she makes a big mistake. But if you're looking for the opportunity to punish her when her spells are on cooldown, that's going to be your best bet, especially if you have gap closers as well. So a champion like Jax is a good example. You only have one gap closer. Unlucky your champ didn't come out this season. You don't have 25. But if she uses her shield or a Q, something like that, and you can lead with movement, auto WE, hold on to Q, and then jump onto her to follow her, there's going to be your best bet. Same with Renekton, you don't want to just double dash onto her head. If you can lead with movement and hold on to E1, or sometimes use E1 when her spells are on cooldown, hold on to E2 so you can stick onto her and not let her get away, that is going to be your best bet for being able to get a solo kill up against her. Now, for Nasus, the best champions to play up against him are of course champs that can punish his weak early game. But they can be quite tricky on some champs that get really neutralized by his Wither. So champions that can disengage it or aren't as affected by it, mainly spell-based top laners like Ambessa or Riven, who are also strong early game, or a champion like Olaf, really powerful early game, ulti completely drops the Wither. These are going to be your best bets. Another option is a champion that can outrange him, like a Cassiopeia. You can poke him down from range, the Wither doesn't even affect you that much even if he does get it onto him, so these are going to be good options for you. Now, some advice for playing up against him: it can be quite hard to let the wave bounce back all the way on the season. It's not the same as last year where you could just 3-wave crash, let wave 4 and 5 come back, and get a guaranteed killer on a lot of these champions. A lot of the time, you actually want to hard shove a wave, and then stack 2 together. Because if you let it come back to you, he'll build a big wave, and if you trade onto him once, it's going to break your bounce back anyway most of the time, especially if you have big AoE abilities. So you stack 2 waves at the same time, you hard shove it as fast as you can, and then it should bounce back out relatively close to the center. Then you can stand between the caster minion and him, and not let him walk up at all. The problem with just pushing in waves and trading onto him one time is he can lifesteal a lot of that damage back and pick up most of his farm and Q stacks. And especially if you're letting the wave come back to you, again, he's going to be lifestealing, stacking Q, building a big wave. You should still do that, especially if your jungler is coming top, or you're a champion that can run him down like a Darius, something like that. Perfectly fine. But a lot of the time, you just want to stack 2 waves at a time, and don't let him approach the wave at all. And if you do force a big trade onto him and the wave breaks, just get it in as fast as you can so that the next wave bounces back near the center as well. Moving on to Sion. Now, the best champions to play up against a Sion are champs that can hard dominate him in the early lane, but also hard outscale him inside and shred him as well. So champs like Gwen, champs like Darius do extremely well into him, because Sion is quite weak in the 1-4, 1-5 stages of the lane, especially pre-first recall, when he's quite squishy, doesn't have any resistances yet. That's when you want to be punishing him the hardest. So champs like Riven do quite well as well, as you have a lot of threat and reach onto him, really hard for him to hit his Q onto you, so you can snowball quite handily in that lane. But I'd say that a Riven matchup's not as good as a champion that can win the lane and destroy him in side lane as well, like a Gwen. Another option is a champion like Yone, where the lane is not as good, so it's kind of the polar opposite of Riven, where the lane's not as good, but the side lane is going to be free. Once you've bladed Ruin King, you just completely run him down, hard for him to really do anything up against you. You never want to be in a situation where even if he's 0-5 proxy silent style, he just keeps you stuck under tower and side lane. It's really important that you play a champion that can beat him inside and in lane if you can. Now, if you can't do that, if you don't have access or the ability to play those champions, perfectly fine, just making sure you're trying to get a lead early. Jax is a great example. He can beat you up inside if you're even or even slightly behind, so it's important that you get a lead early game. 1-5, try to play it volatile, try to play aggressive, try to really get your lead up against him. It's not like back in the day when you had Divine Sunder, completely unplayable for him. You have to work for it now. So champs like that, champs like Camille as well, really important that you don't get behind up against him. Don't underestimate his laning phase, level 5 to 9, where he starts to get a few points in Q and some resistances. That's when he does get a bit tricky, but 1-5 is fair game. You really want to try beat him as hard as you can. Now, if he's one of the proxy inting Sions, make sure you're really careful to not let him get into that proxy position. Once he's there, you're not going to be able to get rid of him. So it's important that you play mainly for prio, and that you have really good tempo recalls. The thing that's annoying about Sion is the death timer counts while he's in passive as well. So when you kill him, it can be quite hard to get a wave in and base. A lot of the time for Sion, you actually want to base with the wave coming back into you on a freeze if you can, because killing him, waiting for the passive to die, then pushing the wave, he's already going to be back to lane with ulti or with TP. So a lot of the time you need a base with the wave coming back towards you, and you need a base as soon as you can, because if he gets to lane before you, crashes the wave and starts to proxy, you're not getting rid of him. Moving on to Volibear. Now, the best champions to play up against him are champions that can completely nullify his QEW combo. You probably felt it before if you're laned up against the bear, where you just get stunned, he's got a big shield and the bite onto you, can't really do anything about it. If you chase him down, he's got the shield, he can just fight you back with his passive especially, and his W2, so you can't really re-trade onto Volibear if he trades onto you. So you want to be doing damage to him without giving him the opportunity to trade. So a champion like Jax, where your E blocks his stun and his W, which is the #1 counter pick, the #1 ban, from the rank 1 Volibear player, bans it every game for that reason, or champions like Aurora, champions like Quinn, where you can keep getting the Volibear lower and lower without taking any damage in response and not give him the opportunity to combo you, because if he tries, you have multiple ways to disengage it. Now, another option would be a champion like Rengar, where it's not really a hard counter per se. You can just shout out of his stun and just neutralize him, build Tiamat, Rush Rev Hydra, and just keep him shoved on the tower because Volibear scales extremely poorly. Now, if you're playing a champion that doesn't match up super well into him, so an example would be a champion like Camille, the number one advice for that is to trade onto him in a way where you can't receive a trade in response. So of course just using Camille W is an easy one, but when the wave is in the center, be very, very careful to walk up. Let the wave come back into you. The thing about Volibear is going to keep his passive stacked up, so the wave will come to you, and then when the wave's in the Camille zone, you can E him off the wall. Just make sure you end your trade in CC. So what I mean by that is you CC them and you're already disengaging before the stun or knockup, whatever it is, expires, so he can't hit you back. If you just E-auto QQ or EQQ on Camille and click backwards with the movement speed and he can't reach you with his combo, that's a free trade of course. So you want to be trying to do that on everything. With Jax, so you lead with movement, you stun him and you run away or Q away before the stun expires. Because if you stun him and greet that one extra auto and then he reaches you with QEW, you're probably going to lose that trade. So most champions have some form of CC, so if you can end your trade in CC, or if you're playing a champion with range abilities, you can get him lower and lower. That's going to be your best approach for playing up against this champion. Just don't give him an opportunity. Of course, he is going to get them sometimes. Try to avoid giving him free opportunities to full combo you, even if you have to give up a minion or two along the way. Now, for Cassandre, this champ is quite hard to punish for the majority of melee champions, I'd say. So champs like Gnar or champs like Vayne, where you can just poke him lower and lower without taking any damage yourself, and especially these champions beat him in side lane later on, where a champ like Kennen, amazing in lane up against Cassandre, but you're not going to be able to keep him stuck under tower in the mid game the way a Gnar or a Vayne could, so they are a little bit better. Now, some melee options are a champion like Ambessa, where it's not a hard winning matchup, it's slightly Ambessa favorite, I'd say, but you can avoid his Q and his W. It's mainly a skill shot based champion, as granted you use your abilities well. Now, Poppy is also a good counter, as you can completely nullify his W and his E, his W being the more OP parts of his kit. For a melee champion to lane up against, you can completely nullify that and just poke him down from range with your passive buckler and your Q. So these types of champions where you don't really have to fully commit onto them are going to be your best bet. Now, some advice up against them is, of course, dodge his Qs, try to pre-dodge them if you can, they're quite quick, but let's say you're playing a champion like Jax. You really need to play around his W. If you jump onto his head, you're going to get completely annihilated. You need to lead with movement, auto WE, and then Q away to dodge his W at the last second. Same with a champion like Renekton, where if you jump onto him, you're going to get destroyed. So try to hold on to your second E if you can. Or Camille, you can't just no-scope an E onto him, you'll get wrecked. You can see the pattern here. You can't be in a situation where you have nothing left in the tank to avoid his W. The CC is way too long. He can fully charge W, auto Q, auto, and click away, and you're still going to be stunned. It's really depressing, so make sure you're playing around that ability the most if you're playing any type of melee champion into him. Moving on to Renekton, and the best counter picks to Renek is going to be champions like Kennen, champions like Jayce, where you can just keep your distance, slowly chip away at him, get him lower and lower, and if he ever tries to get onto you, really easy to disengage. Jayce hammer E, Kennen stun, E away, you're going to be in a really good position. Now, some other options are champions that can just straight up out-static him, like a Warwick or a Volibear, where if he forces onto you, you can just beat him down. Really hard for him to do anything in those types of matchups. Now, some advice for playing up against Renekton, his level 1 is actually not as strong as a lot of people think. Because level 3, when he has good Fury, you do have to be careful, but level 1, you can take good trades onto him as champions like Jax, champions like Camille, where at level 3 it does start to get a bit more dicey, so making sure up against him you don't just completely concede the lane from level 1. Also, jungle tracking is more important up against Renekton, especially if he has a combo like Renekton Talia, Renekton Italy, so making sure you're keeping that in mind. The flashpoint click stun is just way too hard to deal with, so make sure you're trying to track the jungle more if you play up against this champion. Now, for Kayle, the best champions to pick up against her are champions with huge kill threat in lane, but also dominator in the side lane later on. So champs like Irelia, champs like Jax, champs like Riven, you pretty much beat her at every point in the game. Granted, you can snowball and you don't get behind anything like that. Where if we compare that to a champion like Sett, you can win the 1-5, but if you don't get a explosive lead up against her, she's going to outscale you very quickly, run you down with tier 2 boots, and range form, especially in the side lane. This matchup just gets harder and harder. It's better to play champions that can win the lane and side lane as well. Another example would be a champion like Kayle, where the 1-5 is not quite as good, but you can kill her pretty much any point in the game if you're not behind. Really easy for you as well. It's hard for her to react to your R2 with her ulti when she wants to ulti your burst most of the time, so this matchup's quite easy to farm kills in as well. Some advice when you're playing up against Kayle, you've probably heard it before, but you need to try get a lead early game. Make it volatile, make it explosive, don't let her touch the wave at all. and really try to let the wave come back towards you 1 to 4, because you need to get some guaranteed advantage up against him, because if she can farm tier 2 boots, Swifties, or sometimes Berserkers, depends on the matchup, and get that unscathed, she can actually beat a lot of melee champions, so you need to make it explosive, you need to communicate to your jungler, and really make it your life's mission to set her behind. Moving on to Jayce, who is not only one of the strongest top lane champs in the game at the moment, but also a very powerful blind pick. The options you have up against him are going to be champions that can force all-ins onto him, like an Irelia or a Rengar, where you want to make it very volatile. You want to get both of you to low HP. That's going to benefit the champion like Irelia, who has more all-in threat. Or if you try to make it volatile on a champion like Jax, his disengage is too good. He can just knock you away, poke you down. You don't really have the same sticking power that these other counter picks have. Where another option would be a champion like Cassiopeia, where you can slightly outrange him, do damage to him without taking any in response, and because you have access to Conqueror, you can beat him in an extended trade as well if he does try to force onto you. Pretty similar to Yorick, you can go fishing for E, especially level 6 onwards if you hit one, but the cage up really hard for him to do anything in that type of matchup. Where if you play a champion like Camille into him, he can just poke you down lower and lower. If you force onto him and he re-engages onto you, it can be quite hard for you to do any meaningful damage or stick onto him in that lane. Where if you play other options, something to keep in mind, you want to be playing for gank setup. Jayce is still very easy to gank, not as easy as before, but that's still going to be a realistic win condition for a lot of champions, especially if you're playing a bruiser or a tank with CC. You want to make sure you're communicating to your jungler in advance, trying to stay high HP if your jungler is coming to your side, because if you're too low to receive the gank, there's no way you can really get out of that hard lane position. So, for example, on Camille, even if you have your ulti, if you're 400 HP and he's like almost full HP, 80 or 90%, you're probably not going to be able to receive a gank very easily. So you need to stay high HP, give up some minions early game, play for their gank. Of course, if the Jayce makes mistakes, you will be able to beat him 1v1. He's not completely unbeatable. Just making sure you're trying to conserve HP and play for a gank if your jungler is pathing towards you. One more piece of advice as well is making sure you're punishing his hammer E cooldown. It's extremely long. A lot of champions gap closes. It's going to be shorter than it. So if you jump onto his head with a Jax Q and don't use your E and he knocks you away, then you've got a great opportunity to use Q and E together. That's how you're going to win the trade up against him. Of course, that's the onus is on Jayce to disrespect when his E is down, but it's something you can look out for because a lot of Jayces do make that mistake. Moving on to Urgot, and the best picks into this champion are champs that have ways to outplay or completely space out his E. So champions like Olaf, you can just completely nullify his E or his ulti. Champs like Cassante, you have gap closes, your W can just block it as well if your E's on cooldown. Or even a champ like Jayce, you can just poke him down and rely on your good spacing and your gate E to dodge it. I wouldn't say this one's as hard of a counter for the average player, but in higher ranks this matchup can be quite unplayable. Another option would be an ease of execution counter, a champion like Poppy, where your W just completely removes his E from the game, so it's really easy just to poke him down with Qs and autos and just block his E if he tries. Now, some advice for playing up against Urgot if you don't have a hard counter champion is making sure you're always keeping his E in mind. So a good example of this is if you're playing Jax. You pretty much never want to just Q onto the Urgot's head. If you do that, he's going to flip you and you're going to lose the trade. What you want to do is lead with movement, walk towards him, auto WE, and then avoid his flip with your Q. You're not going to dodge Urgot E if you're already next to him, so utilizing a gap closer or a movement speed steroid, maybe like a Garen Q, something like that, is going to be the way to go. Now, movement speed is not going to be a guaranteed dodge, so the gap closer is going to be the best approach, so Jax Q, maybe Renekton E, always keeping it in mind. Approach with movement, use your abilities onto him, and the second you see him get his shield up, so don't try to react to the dash animation. When he's got his shield, he's going to be eating you, so you can already pre-dodge in advance. Next up we have Irelia, and the best counters of this champion are champs that can just completely stat check her, like a Warwick or a Volibear, because Irelia has to commit. She doesn't really farm from range very well, and she has to snowball, and if she wants to crash a wave or take any type of trade onto, she has to be in melee range. So champs that can just completely destroy her, like Warwick or Volley, do extremely well. Some other options are a champion like Poppy, where you completely neutralize her in lane and in team fights, because she has to snowball. You don't really have to on a champ like Poppy, or a champ like Gragas, you can just nullify her, or an option, a champion like Jax, where the lane is actually not that great for Jax, to be honest, more of a skill matchup. However, because you can deal with her in side lane the whole time, and you have point-click CC to deal with her in a team fight, that's going to do very well for you. She really struggles into high CC comps, so a champion with crowd control that's very easy to get onto her, especially a champion that can realistically fight her back, like the champions mentioned, are going to be the best way for you to go. Now, when playing up against Irelia, it's really important that you note she is a weak level 1 champion until she's stacked. You need to find her right away. A lot of people just walk in, start hitting the wave and chilling. Irelia triple stacks and Qs onto your head, you're going to get destroyed in that trade. You need to try to zone her, you need to try to find her on the majority of champions, even a champ like Garen. where your level 1's not that famous, but you can completely destroy Irelia in a level 1 fight if she doesn't get stacked. So you need to find her straight away. You need to try zone her from XP and not let her stack up for free. Moving on to Dr.Mundo, and this is another one of those champions where you want to pick a counter that can beat him in lane and outscale him in side lane as well. So champions like Gwen, champs like Warwick or Irelia, these are going to be your best bet. You never want to be in a situation where you shit on him for the whole early lane, first 13 minutes, and then he just rocks up with his warmogs and starts headbutting your tower down and outscales you really hard inside. Another option would be a champion like Aatrox, where even though you don't really outscale him that hard inside, the lane is so good for you, you can almost guarantee an advantage, granted you play out the matchup well. Now, some advice when playing up against Mundo, it's quite tricky if he just sits 2 screens away and farms with Q, so you can either look to freeze and punish him when he walks up, because then he has to make a choice, either Q the last hit or Q you, and if he Qs you, he's probably going to miss that farm and hopefully the XP. You can try to do that approach, or you can just try to proxy or use your prio to be really involved in the game, and just make sure no matter what, you're trying to force grub fights. It's pretty rare that you're going to be on a champion that's less useful than Dr.Mundo in the early grub fights, so making sure you're trying to get involved, let your jungler know you want to play for them, and using your prio as well as you can. Moving on to Gnar, and even though Gnar is a ranged top laner, it's important to keep in mind he's one of the weakest in the game. His damage is not something that you have to respect as much as a champion like Aurora or a champion like Jayce or Cannon. You can completely brute force it on a lot of champions. So the best counters will be champs like Irelia or Yasuo, really high threat onto him. They can make it really volatile, make it really hard for him to farm freely, or even a champion like Jayce where you can do a bit of both, force onto him and poke him from range. Another option, really similar, champion like Riven, just really high kill threat, really high range abilities to dash onto them and make it really hard for Gnar to kite you and play it out. Because to be honest, in side lane in the mid game, there's not a lot of champions that can beat at even or ahead Triforce tier 2 boots Gnar. So keeping that in mind, the number 1 tip up against him, make it volatile. Of course, playing around his mega, that goes without saying. If he's freshly exhausted or low mega bar, really easy for you to win the trade. And if he's 80, 90 or full mega, of course, be respectful. But you need to make the game volatile. So a good example is playing a champ like Camille or a champ like Jackson to Gnar, where if you don't do anything, if it's perfectly even, he gets tabbies in level 7, you're going to get wrecked. If the Gnar is good, it's going to be very hard for you, but if you force a Jax Q-Star, just jump on his head, bash him down. Camille, force onto him with even E-Start if you can. Make it volatile, get both of you low HP, because that's going to benefit you a lot more than the Gnar player. He can't really function as a low HP mini-Gnar, and if you can make him recall before he gets tier 2 boots on his first base, and he has to come back with like Ruby, Longsword, something like that, it's going to be even easier for you. Next up we have Illaoi, and I'm pretty sure if all top lanes on the planet could vote to remove a champion from the game, it would probably be this one. Now, there are some things you can keep in mind for playing up against her, but first we'll go through the counter picks. So some champions that do well are champs that have a lot of outplay potential against her E. So champs like Aurora, multiple gap closers and great poke. Champs like Gwen, your W and your E can outplay it. Even a champ like Rumble, you can rely on your W to avoid it, and you have a lot of high poke and forcing tools as well. Another option would be a champ like Tryndamere, where you can just pretty much ignore the matchup. 1 to 5 you win, and after you base and get Tiamat, you can just start to proxy or even tier 2 boots, doesn't matter. Just proxy and avoid her out sustain her, as Illaoi has pretty bad sustain, so Tryndamere can beat her and if you play that style. Now, most of the time, you won't be playing these hard counter champions, most of them aren't that popular, so some advice for playing up against her. You need to be thinking about her E at all times and punishing it when it's on cooldown. You want to be using the minion wave, of course, to block her E, and when you go for a minion that's out in the open, you need to be seeing what she sees. You need to look through your lane from her point of view. She is going to try to EU if you run towards her or if you go for a minion that's in open space. So you know that you can run towards a minion and juke back preemptively, dodging your E, and then that's going to be on cooldown. You can hard force onto her. Also keeping in mind her 1 to 5, her all-in is very weak. You don't need to respect her ulting, of course. So if you're playing a champion like Jax, something like that, you can look to force onto her early game. Now, later on in the game, well, pretty much the entire lane, something I don't see a lot of people keeping in mind, you can dodge the tentacles, even in ulti form. That's a lot harder. You might need to go Ultra Instinct for that one, but you can dodge the tentacle slams on the wall. You don't need to run up and kill the tentacles. I see that way too many times, where someone will hit the tentacle, they'll tank her Q or her E, something like that, or they just won't punish her and let her farm for free while you're doing that. You don't really need to kill them unless you fully have free time. Unless she's under the tower, you can't poke her or not in lane, something like that. Don't waste time on it. Try to pressure her, try to attack her instead, because if you go into that open space and hit the tentacles, you're going to get punished. Now, when you do trade onto her, you can dodge them. You need to think about where they're going to go when she Ws you and already start to move, but if you just stand there and fight her, really easy for them to hit. It seems basic, but a lot of people make this mistake. You can dodge most of them on the wall, especially if she hasn't ulted and has that the extra attack speed of them, you can, as long as you're keeping them in mind and you're pre-dodging, you're not just trying to stick onto her head and bash her down, you can dodge those quite consistently. So try and outplay your E and the tentacles on the wall, constantly thinking about it. It does require a lot of mental stack. A lot of people don't like playing up against her. And it can feel like if you get behind and you're stuck under your tower with no wave and she's just fishing for ease, it's unplayable. So you need to play better before you get into that unplayable position and put some pressure onto her. She's not that strong 1-5. You need to look for an advantage and making sure you're constantly thinking about baiting out her E, punishing when it's on cooldown, and trying to dodge the wall tentacle slams as well. Moving on to Riven, and the two approaches you can take when playing up against her is either lockdown or easy disengage. So Renekton, of course, you have both. You can lock it down, point click CC, and disengage really hard for her to play up against you, or a champion like Jayce or Kennen, we have really good disengage. So she has no sustain, so you can just chip away at her, get her lower and lower, and as long as you have good spacing and use your disengage well, and play different when your Jayce E or your Kennen combos on cooldown, you can just make it really difficult for her. Another one, of course, is going to be Quinn. That one's going to be a lot easier. You just kick her in the head with your E if she tries to force onto you. And a big thing to keep in mind when playing up against a Riven is she has to use multiple gap closers to even reach you. The trade's not going to be as scary. Or if you hit a minion next to her and she starts her combo already with Q1 hitting you, it's going to be a really bad time for you. So making sure you're trying to make her come onto your side and use gap closers to reach you, taking nice short trades, getting her lower and lower, ending your trade in CC as well. So Jax, for example, don't just jump onto her head and stun her and get beat down. Lead with movement, stun her and then disengage later on, because you're going to really hard lose that trade if you just blow everything onto her right away and not ending that trade in CC. So disengage being the name of the game. If you can play a champion that can disengage her after trading with her or after poking her down, you're going to have a really good shot playing up against it, because if she doesn't snowball in the early game, the champ's not as scary as you've probably faced before, where she gets 2 or 3 kills and it feels really, really unplayable. Next up, we have Gangplank, and you have two approaches to this one. You can either play a champion that can hard force onto him and try kill him early game, like an Irelia, or champions that can completely destroy him in the resource battle. He has no sustain, his mana cost can be quite brutal at times, so champs like Tryndamere or Cassiopeia or Cho'gath, you can just keep trading with him, and even if they're even trades, it's going to be worse and worse for him. Cassiopeia, not as much, you don't want to take that much damage in response, but you can outrange him, you win the extended trade. That matchup can be hard, but champs like Tryndamere and Cho'gath, quite easy to execute, as you just keep trading onto him, out-sustaining what he does back, and it's going to be really hard for him to win that extended laning phase. Now, some advice when playing up against him: a lot of people really fear the barrels, where early game, if he has to use 2 barrels onto you, and you've got D-Shield especially, it's not really going to do much. You don't need to be afraid. Walk up, hit the wave, try trade onto him. As long as he's not single barreling you, anything like that, it's not going to be a big issue. The barrel cooldown is quite long, so if he has to double barrel you every time, he's not going to be able to do that consistently enough, and making sure you're always trying to make him recall before Shen if you can. Try to make it volatile, try to play aggressive in the early 1-3, depending on your champion of course, but if you can make him recall and have to go swords or something like that, of course it's going to be really horrible for him, because that champ is pretty much full build at Shen. That's when the matchup gets quite tricky, so if you make it very volatile and explosive before that point, that's going to give you a good shot. Moving on to Shen, and up against this guy, you want to play champions that can keep him stuck under tower with no real option. So champs like Olaf, champs like Illaoi, you do have to be a little bit careful levels 1-3, but especially level 6 onwards, you can just keep him stuck there, poking him, never able to ulti away. Some other options would be a ranged champion like Kennen, just keep poking him under tower, unable to do anything, or even a champion like Tryndamere, where the lane is not really a hard counter, but you can just start to proxy and you're going from Tiamat to Rav Hydra. It's going to be really hard for him to go anywhere without losing so many tower plates, and you can even eat his jungler's camps when you're in that proxy position. Really hard for him to really do anything if he doesn't get a lead early game in that type of matchup. So the goal up against him is, of course, make it really painful for him to ulti away. Be careful 1-3. On most champions, he can do surprisingly a high amount of damage, but once you're level 6, you have access to your combat ulti. You can just keep him stuck there. Don't just do one wave after the other, just giving him free fun. Stack 2 waves at a time, but just be ready if he ever ultis away, or if you see action happening on the map, anticipate that he can ult down, then you can start pushing the wave. Sometimes you'll see a bot skirmish, you'll one-shot a wave, and then he won't ulti, because he knows he'll lose too much. That's fine. You're stopping him from being impactful, you're stopping him from being useful, because this champion's not that good in a team fight setting, especially if he's even. And if he ever ultis away and you get 2 or 3 plates and proxy the next wave, he's going to be so far behind, it's going to be hard for him to do anything unless that play was super impactful. You're not going to stop him from ulting every time, you just need to make sure you're in a position that if he does ulti, you can really hard punish him for it. Next up we have Tryndamere, and of course this champion can pretty much only auto attack, so champions that can counter that, like Teemo with your blind, Malphite with your E, that's going to be your best bet. Another option would be a strong champion that can stat check him like a Warwick, or even a special mention would be a champion like Jayce, where Jayce is actually surprisingly not a lane counter to Tryndamere, but you can match him the entire game. You can beat him in lane, you can beat him in side lane, you can always really match him, so that's a nice skill matchup I would say. Now the thing about Tryndamere that you need to keep in mind, his identity has shifted in recent years, he is the sustain king. He has no mana, his Q heals him, he's going to take D-Shield, Grasp, Second Wind, all those really fun runes, so you can't stay in the lane too long. There's not really any champion in the game that can match his sustain. So if you ever miss a recall, you might find yourself stuck in lane, unable to play. It's really important that you have good back time as you leverage your TP well, since he's probably not going to have TP, and never find yourself in a situation where you're like low mana, half HP, and you choose to stay. That's going to benefit him if you could have recalled on that timer. Really important that you don't miss a back timer against him. He can just stay in lane forever. He can just keep healing from his Fury, his Q, and all of the rune setup he's going to take. So it's really important that you base at the right time and use your TP as well. You've got TP, he doesn't most of the time, so make sure you're using your TP, come back with an item advantage. If you trade with him quite heavily, you come back with an extra longsword, potions, and full HP, you're going to be in a really good position. Just make sure you never miss a backtime rep against this champion. That is the #1 rule, because he just out-sustains every champion in the long run. Next up we have Ornn, and some counter picks of this champ are going to be ones like Aatrox or Darius or Gwen, where the lane is very favored for you, and you don't really get that outscaled in side lane either, especially on a champ like Gwen or Darius, you can pretty much always beat Ornn, granted you're not behind. Another option would be a champ like Illaoi, where you can make it very hard for him to ever play the game, because the thing about Ornn is he's one of the more useful top lane champs in the game, in a grouped up setting, especially in the mid game. So if you can play a champ like a Gwen or an Illaoi, just keep him stuck under tier 2 the whole time, and if he ever leaves, where most Ornn players want to, they didn't pick Ornn just to stay under a tower all day, they want to group up and ulti people. If they do that, and you can break tier 2s, really good way for you to get accelerated and make it really hard for Ornn to ever leave the lane in the future. Next we have Trundle, and the thing about this champion is he just straight up can't function into range. So champs like Teemo, champs like Gnar or Jayce, especially a champion like Gnar or Teemo that have a bit more side laning power up against him, make his champ pretty useless. He's pretty weak in a team fight, so if he can't win side lane 1v1, his champ has very little value. A melee option, if you don't like playing ranged tops, would be a champion like Jayce. Of course, your E completely nullifies his auto attacks and his Q, which is pretty much the entire kit. So champs that can beat him in side lane, but more importantly dominate him in lane as well, are going to be the best approach up against him. The thing when you play up against Trundle in the mid game, he is only going to split push for the most part. If he groups, sweet, that's easy for you, but the thing about that is making sure you don't TP into a play at a bad time. If you give Trundle tier 2 towers, he can get unstoppable pretty quickly. So making sure you push inside, move to the play, and then TP back to the tier 2 is going to be the better pattern. I've seen it way too many times where someone's farming top, they TP into a dragon fight, give up tier 2, and then Trundle or any split pushing champ really is just out of control. So it's important that you push inside, go to that dragon fight early, and then TP back top when you need to before he gets anything, so that you can gain a guaranteed advantage for your team. Next up we have Fiora. Now the weakness of this champion in the lane is she can't really farm from a distance, and she has terrible sustain early game before she gets Ravenous Hydra. Her wave clear is so bad, if you can ever put her in a position where she can't recall, her lane's done. So champions like Kennen, champs like Jayce or Pantheon are going to do really well into her, as you can force trades every time she tries to farm, and it's really hard for her to ever get a recall into champions like that, because they have pretty good wave clear and poke as well. Another option would be a champion like Renekton, where the level 1's not that good, but later on, especially level 6, Fiora's ulti isn't really that much combat power. Into a champ like Renekton with 2 dashes and CC, really hard for her to really get high value from it, so you can beat her in a lot of points in the game. Of course, you will get outscaled very quickly if you don't get a lead in lane, but it's very favored for you. You can win short trades. If she tries to all in you, you can pop ulti, so a champ like Renekton does quite well. Now, some advice when playing up against her ties into what we touched on. Keep in mind the sustain battle is going to be the way to go. She's really bad sustain and wave clear, so if you can ever block the wave in front of your tower, or put her in a position where it's really awkward for her to recall, that should be the goal. Don't just go into it trying to kill her. Of course, take the free kill if you can, but keep in mind it's really hard for her to ever clear a wave. So if she makes a mistake with her slow pushing, hard pushing, and you can block the wave from crashing into your tower, It can be very, very uncomfortable for her to kill those caster minions under tower or get the wave in. You can keep it there for a long time. Really hard for her to poke you down as well if you can trade from really close to your tower. Moving on to Warwick, and of course this is one of the strongest melee laners in the game, so champions that don't have to give him range to hit you, like an Aurora, a Gnar, or Cassiopeia, are going to be the best bet. Now, not everyone likes playing ranged champions, so a good melee is not really a counter, but a good answer would be a champion like Jax, where your E just blocks his auto attacks, of course, and if you get your healing cut first recall, which is what I recommend, by the way, on any champion that you play in, the only champs you really need healing cut into every time is Warwick and Zac. So if you can save up 800 and base and TP back on any AD champion for execution or something like that, or Oblivion Orb on a champ like Gwen, you're going to be in a really good position. Don't tunnel too hard on, oh, I've got Ignite, I don't need healing cut. Really good to go both up against Warwick specifically. Now, Jax is a good answer because you can match him in lane, match him inside. It's relatively easy to go even. Just don't Q onto his head and beat him down, and if you do, make sure you end your trade in CC and take nice short trades with your grasp. Now, the goal up against Warwick is to kind of play it slow 1 to 5, get your healing cut first recall, TP back, and then you can start to do trades. The thing about him is he's one of the best at extended trades, so your goal is to poke him down without taking any damage in response, and then when he's low, you can try to burst him, granted you have healing cut. But it's not a champion that you're ever going to win a full HP fight to the death on pretty much any champ in the game, so try to chip away at him, get him lower and lower, try to leverage your TP well, because he's always going to have barrier and flash most likely, leverage your TP advantage to get resources and item advantage, and if you can get healing cut on your first recall, sometimes your second, but first recall would be nice, that is the way to go. Moving on to Camille, and the best counter picks to her at the moment are champions like Renekton, champs like Warwick or Volibear, where you can just straight stat check her. Really hard for her to do anything. The 1 to 3 is not too bad, but level 3 onwards until she has Triforce can be really brutal for her. Another option would of course be Jax. I'd say this is not as hard of a lane counter as it was in the past, but you can match her the entire game. Now, something that's very consistent amongst all these champions, Renekton does have the added bonus of being able to shadow her passive shield with his enhanced W, but most of these champions have some form of CC. Now, versus Camille, if you use your CC just as her E hits the wall and pulls her away, you'll completely cancel it. So if you manage to crash a wave, let it come back towards you, and you can cancel her E disengage, she's dead. She's probably not going to have flash most of the time. Champs like Warwick or Volibear, she can't really fight you back. Really hard for her to do anything, especially Renekton level 6, so you can see the pattern here. You want to be punishing Camille's weak early game, even though Camille's 1 to 4, 1 to 5 is pretty good in some matchups, not really in these ones. Renekton's the more doable one out of the 3 during that 1 to 3. But all of these champions get prio up against her, which means they get the level advantages, and then it just gets harder and harder later as the lane goes on, up until she has Triforce. You also want to try force early grub fights as a Shen Camille at the first grub fight compared to a level 6 Warwick or Volibear, Renekton, you just can't compare them. So make sure you get your team involved, play for that, because Camille does scale extremely well, but if you can get a lot of action done and make the lanes volatile on these strong champions, you can really make it hard for her. That advice applies to any champion with CC as well, trying to block her E from disengaging. That's going to be the play, and another piece of advice as well. Her passive cooldown, is very long early game. Levels 1 to 6, it's 18 seconds. So there's going to be a lot of timers where you want to bait her to use passive and run away before you trade. So you need to lay the groundwork first. So for example, if you're playing Garen, you don't want to QE her. You want to joust her first. Just right click her, trade 1 auto each. Now her passive's down for 18 seconds. Then you want to go in with your combo. Make sure you lay the groundwork first. It's really, there's a lot of visual clarity. If she has her passive up or not, you can left click her, you can see the animation. And when her passive is up, make sure you just trade 1 auto each. When it's down, now it's time to go. Next up, we have Yasuo. And I didn't think I'd put him in this guide, but his pick rate has been surprisingly high recently. And the best answers to him are going to be champions that can force onto him very easily and run him down. So champs like Renekton, champs like Pantheon or Darius, where your kill threat in lane is extremely high, as Yasuo has to walk up to farm. It's a little bit different, similar to Yone in a way, but Yone has a lot of escape tools. Yasuo cannot. He has to go forward, so champions that can completely destroy him. Another one would be Warwick as well, where they can just stat check him or brute force it. Especially champions with lockdown, champs like Renekton or Pantheon are full game counters. Yasuo cannot really teamfight into these big beefy AD bruisers with point and click CC, makes it really hard for him, and the matchups are pretty much unplayable for him as well. Next we have Pantheon, and the best answers to him are always going to be champions that can neutralize him. So champs like Gragas, champs like Malphite, It's very easy to go even up against him, and most champs, if you can go even versus Panth, you will outscale him extremely hard, and not even later on in the game. Level 6 onwards, when Pantheon doesn't really have an ulti in terms of 1v1 combat power, a lot of these champions can actually start to beat him, especially he doesn't really have good sustain, so champs like Gragas and Malphite do very, very well into him. Some options for more less tanky melees would be one like Tryndamere, where it's not a hard counter, but very easy to go even and neutralize him, and then when you get your wave clear from Tiamat Rev Hydra, you can just keep him stuck under tower, really hard for him to really gain an advantage in that type of matchup. Rengar's another one where you can just shout off of his stun, and you can really match his early game aggression. Now, some advice for playing up against Pantheon is don't feel too pressured to get a lead against him early game. Of course, it's not going to be in your favor, but a lot of champions lose to Pantheon 1-5, Renekton being an example, but 6 onwards you can beat him as you get so much combat power from your ulti, where Gwen is another one, really brutal matchup. I'm not saying it's favored for you level 6, but that's when you have more options. If he jumps onto you, buff your ulti Q through it, you can chunk him really hard, and because Pantheon has no sustain, and most of the time no TP, if you can get him low resources, unable to recall, he can be in an unplayable position. Next we have Gragas, and some good answers to this champion are Gwen, Gnar, and Cho'gath. But it's all for different reasons. So Gwen, you can put your W up the WQE combo, and he can't really disengage you with E, and you can just play for fun. You have W and your E to dodge his barrel poke, so you can mainly just free farm in this matchup. Even if you don't gain an advantage, going even as Gwen is going to benefit you a lot more than Gragas. Now with Gnar, the 1-5 is not that good for you. It's not that bad either, but because you have so much movement speed, especially when you base and get Swifty Boots early on, or Merc Treads depending on how much gold you have, you can look to dodge his barrels, cut them out, and keep him stuck under tower, and even proc demolish procs eventually, granted you're playing the matchup well. And for Cho'gath, you just out-sustain him completely. You can just beat him up early game, you just heal off the wave, really hard for him to gain an advantage up against you, as you actually have better sustain than him, which is one of the bigger benefits of playing Gragas. Now, one more option, more of a fun counter pick, is Sylas, where the lane is not super amazing, but if the Gragas player makes a mistake and you can stick onto him, beating down with Conqueror, maxing W and going more of a tanky build, you can really get a big lead in this game, and you can be a little bit more useful than him later on, and even steal his ulti and be a Sylas with Gragas ulti, which is not as good, of course, as Malphite, but still pretty good. Now, some advice for playing up against Gragas is don't just accept that he's going to hit you with every single Q. Make it hard for him, make him work for it. Pretend to go for a minion, click to the side, pre-dodge it. Don't just tank every Q every time you go for a minion. Also, if you're playing a champion with a dash, be very mindful of his E. So Jax is a perfect example. You always want to walk towards Gragas with movement, auto WEM, he ease you away, and then you can Q follow him. On Jax, it's only really possible with Merc Treads, but if the Gragas makes a spacing mistake, and you can punish him when his E's on cooldown, that's what you want to be looking to do. But don't just jump on his head and get fully disengaged on like Renekton E, Jax Q, stuff like that. Lead with movement if you can, and bait him to use his E, and then you can jump onto him. And as for Gwen, the best counter picks to her are going to be champions that can punish her short range early game. So champs like Riven, champs like Pantheon. If she ever walks up to try Q you, or farm the minions, you can easily punish her. Or if you play a champion with no gap closer, she can space you with Q, disengage with E, can be a little bit annoying. Another option is a champion like Jax, where lead with movement, hold onto your Q. You can follow her Illaoi with your Q as long as you have good movement. I wouldn't say that matchup's amazing for Jax. I'd say it's a slightly Jax favored skill matchup. But if you have good movement, you hold onto your Q and you can match her in side lane as well. Definitely a good pickup. Now, another option would be a champion like Kennen. Just straight up champions that are ranged like Kennen or Aurora, those types of champs do very well into her as well. But I know most people like to play melees into her as you can hard punish the early game, where if she goes D-Shield second wind and just kind of chills, goes down a bit of farm, she can more or less scale into those range picks. Now, some advice for playing up against Gwen is the center part of her Q does significantly more damage. So it's going to be impossible to dodge every single Q. But if you can move in an erratic, creative way, so that she just can't hit the center onto you every single time, try to make her hit the outer part of it, or ideally completely dodge it, then you're going to be in a better position. Also, against it, to be very careful of committing your gap closer when she has ulti. If you just Q onto her head as Jax, or Q on as Fiora, your parry's down, something like that, she can just dump 3 ultis onto you straight away. And even if she doesn't kill you, she's going to completely hard win the trade, and then you won't really have any room to play. When she's level 6 onwards, you want to chip away at her. Get her lower and lower ideally before you go for that all-in, because not many champions can just straight brute force up against her if she's full HP with ulti. Moving on to Tahm Kench. Now you have 2 options up against him. My personal favorite is countering him with Olaf, as it's really hard for him to play the game. You can neutralize his ulti and his stun with your ulti, and also if you go the Rev Hydra build, you can just keep him stuck under tower the whole time, and if you get the wave bouncing back, you can even run him down as well. Now, an alternative is champions like Gnar or Aurora, so the best Tahm Kench play in Korea actually bans those 2 champions every game, which means he pops into champ select and asks for a ban as well, just so he doesn't have to face either one of them. The benefit of Gnar over Aurora is you'll beat Tahm Kench in lane and in side lane as well, where Aurora, the lane phase is way more powerful for you, but the side lane's not going to be as good. Another option is just slamming Gwen and playing for good farm. You're not going to hard dump to the Tahm Kench player if he's good, but at least you can free farm and completely outscale him. Now, some advice for playing against Tahm, of course playing around his Q is the number one. Use the wave to block it, try to bait him to use it at the last second and then dodge, and then punish him when it's on cooldown, but also just go into the lane with the right mindset. You do not have to stomp a Tahm Kench in lane. He's a champion that's not really useful unless he snowballs. He's just a big meatball that's main benefit of stat checking, but he gets outscaled by pretty much any top lane champ in the game more or less. So making sure you're going to that matchup with the mindset of just playing for good farm, good recalls. Of course punish him if he does something dumb or if you're in a good matchup like the Aurora or you'll have something like that, but don't try to overstomp the Tahm Kench and get yourself punished, dying to a gank or maybe getting spit under tower, because you don't have to do anything special, just free farm. Next up we have Volibear, and the best counter pick to this champion is of course Irelia. Just because your kill threat is so high onto him, really hard for him to play. You can just Q onto his head with 4 stacks, beat him down, and he has to pull. You can even hold onto your E at times and E him after the pull runs out. Really hard for him to really play out this matchup. Now, some other alternatives are champions like Tryndamere or Cho'gath, because a huge benefit to playing Volibear is your infinite sustain. But Tryndamere and Cho'gath can match that, and they have way better wave clear as well, so they can keep him stuck under tower, unable to play. One more counter pick, you can play Ryze into it if you have that champ mastery, because Ryze can just keep him stuck under tower the whole time, way better wave clear, and you hard outscale him throughout the entire game in side lane. If you ever get ganked in lane or in the mid game, you can just ulti away, so really hard for Volibear to really get anything done in that matchup. Now, some general advice for playing up against this champ is keep in mind a losing, or an even or a slightly winning trade is not going to be that beneficial up against you. He's an infinite sustain champ. You want to be taking trades that are meaningful. You want to get him low HP if you can, so that you can burst him. And the best way to do this is to try to go in 2 cycles. So one trade is trying to bait him to use W, because his W is one of the longest cooldown basic abilities in top lane. So if you can use a spell like a Jax combo, Irelia E, Jax E, whatever it may be, and bait him to use pull, when that pull is on cooldown, you have a massive timer where you can fight him. And if he respects you that whole time, that whole 28-second cooldown, and sits really far back, then you can farm for free, give yourself a lot of breathing room in that lane. Moving on to Heimerdinger. Now, this could be one of the most annoying neutralizers in top lane if you're playing a certain melee champ with no options. But some good counter picks can be champs like Irelia, where you have a lot of kill threat up against them. You can kill towers with your Q, or a champion that can safely farm. That's going to be the best goal up against Heimerdinger if you can safely farm on a champ like Jayce or a champion like Cho'gath, where you can farm from a distance and poke him down, as he doesn't really have any sustain, so Cho and Jayce are great options. Syndra is probably the best counter pick, but it's so hard to play, I would say, in top lane. And I doubt anyone really has experience playing Syndra top, I hope not. But if you have played it before, maybe you're millennia swapping to top, that can be your best bet. But most of the time, playing a champion like Cho or a champion like Gragas, they can just farm and clear the turret from safety, and just trying to get good CS can be the best approach. Now, if you do find yourself counterpicked by it, and you're playing a normal melee champ, the best approach to it is just to concede that there's not really going to be many options for you. It doesn't really sound that glamorous, but go into the game with your D-shield, with your second wind, and really just try to farm. Do your best, of course, to bait out his stun grenade, dodge it, stuff like that, but it's going to be pretty unrealistic for you to force an advantage up against him, especially if he takes exhaust or some combat summoner. The best goal is to stay high HP, get as much farm as you can, communicate strong gank windows in advance to your jungler, so if you stay high HP, that's going to be better for you, and build some early MR. If you're playing a champ like Olaf, you can just build straight Hex Drinker. If you're playing a tank, of course, just go the full Spectre scale, doesn't really matter, but it's really important for you to go into the Heimerdinger matchup with the right mindset. There's not a lot you can do versus a decent Heimerdinger player with combat summoner spells. Especially some of them take exhaust ignite, I'm pretty sure, so you're not really going to have any chance there. So if you're not playing a champion that can farm safely from a distance, just do your best to bait his grenade out, try to pick up as much farm as you can under tower, and try to carry later on in the game. Now, as for Rumble, some good counter picks of this champion are Irelia, Riven, and Galio. Irelia and Riven, pretty straightforward. You have really high all-in threat up against him, as he's in a mobile champion with no escape. Quite easy for you to force solo kills on that champion. Now, Galio is more of a neutralizer, where you get prio, you can win the trades, and there's not really much anything Rumble can do against you, and you're more useful than him in a team fight. You outscale him in the 5v5, so Galio is the easiest execution counter there is. Ryze is another good one. You can keep him shoved under tower, ulti away if you ever get ganked, really similar to Vlad versus Ryze, or Ryze versus Vlad, and the same thing applies to the mid-game macro as well. You can just keep him pinned under tower forever, and ult away if you ever need to. Now, if you're playing a normal bruiser champion up against him, I strongly recommend building some early MR, even if your champion doesn't normally do it. So Hex Drinker on Renekton, Hex Drinker on Olaf, you don't really do it that often. But versus Rumble, it can be a really good option for you, and a lot of these champions can beat him at level 6, even though Rumble's ulti is not bad. In terms of 1v1 combat power, it's not as good as a lot of other strong bruiser champs, so making sure you're waiting for that time that we can all in him, or just punish him if he has bad heat management. If he just overheats and it's about to expire, or he's on 0 heat, so his spells don't get empowered by the yellow bar, then you can trade onto him, but most of the time this champion can get pro and poke you down early game, so you're waiting for your moment to strike and mainly playing for good gank setup as well. Next up we have Vayne, so another ranged top laner, of course countered by Irelia, but some ease of execution counters that you can play into him, a champs like Teemo or Malphite, where of course if she rolls at you, you can just blind her with Teemo Q, and Malphite you can just poke her down, 3 points Q and comment and ult her whenever she's low or your jungler looks at her. Really hard for her to play into that type of matchup. Another option is playing Wukong, because you have so much threat onto her. Her main disengage is her E, so if you can just WR her and she ease your way, then you can ER and maybe even flash to follow if you need to. Really hard for her to get you off her, and you have a lot of kill threat as well. Now, some advice for playing up against Vayne: make sure you utilize bush control quite well. You want to be weaving in and out of the bushes, making her ward them, and not taking any auto attacks for free, of course. Try to make her ward the second bush if you can, so that the third bush is still empty, and you can sit in there and farm for free, and just regen. With D-Shield second win, a lot of the time if you utilize bush control, you can stay pretty healthy early game. And then at level 3 on the bounce back, a lot of bruisers start to have opportunities to punish her, especially if your jungler is pathing up. Really important that you maintain high HP before they get there, so you actually give them a good opportunity to punish her. Next we have Quinn, and the 3 main counter picks to her are going to be Malphite, Wukong, and Rengar. Malphite's going to be the most common ban by far though from any Quinn 1 trick, so it will be hard to get your hands on him, but that is the easiest counter pick you can do. Wukong and Rengar takes a bit of skill, but Wukong vs Quinn very similar to Wukong vs Vayne. One gap closer to bait the Quinny, then the other to stick onto her, and because Quinn has no sustain and most likely no TP, any type of trade you do on her will really stick. Similar to Rengar, you will take some losing trades but you out sustain her, and if you can get her low enough that she's in threat from all in, really hard for her to play, especially if you jump out of the bush with Enhanced Bowler and you can hit onto it, really hard for her to kick you off, so you can take a trade for free at times. Now with Poppy, this is a good counter pick too. You have to be really good on your W timer, but because you have good poke, you can just build early armor. This is an easy of execution counter pick to do as well. Now versus Quinn, just keep in mind she does have her E ability. It is something you're going to have to play around, so don't just full on send a Tryndamere E, Jax Q, whatever you're playing onto her and get kicked away. You're going to lose that trade. You have to be creative, you have to use the bush, you have to try lead with movement, try to put pressure onto her to use her kick, and if you don't have a champion that has that option, you're mainly going to be playing for a good farm, abusing D-Shield second win, and trying to leverage your TP. Most of the time, if you're playing a losing matchup up against Quinn, you should have TP, so if you can use your teleport to gain a resource and item advantage, coming back and you're going to be stronger than her, that's going to be your main win condition. Moving on to my boy Olaf. Now the best counter picks into him are Fiora, Volibear, and Tryndamere. Fiora is actually not too bad in lane, but it's more of a hard scaling counter when she has Ravenous Hydra. If you don't have a lead, that can be really tricky, so the lane is favored, and she just keeps outscaling you as the game goes on, so it can be more of a full game counter. Where Volibear and Tryndamere are more so lane counters. Tryndamere's a bit good out of lane as well, but Volibear and Tryndamere can be quite difficult, especially if Volibear takes Ignite and Phase Rush, which is what the rank 1 Volibear player did when he faced my Olaf. It can be really annoying for you to stick onto him, as he can just cut your ulti for free. Now with Tryndamere, he just has infinite sustain, and a big weakness of Olaf is his mana pool. So if Tryndamere can keep the lane going for a long time, extend the matchup, and keep whittling away at your HP and mana, you might find yourself in a position where you're stuck, especially later on when Tryndamere gets tier met. It can be quite hard to get any options, and because you don't really want to be taking TP on Olaf unless you're versing a neutralizer, Tryndamere will keep pulling you to side. It can be quite frustrating that way. Some other options are champions like Aurora, Kennen of course. Those do quite well into him, but the Aurora Kennen player has to be very good to make it work. If they misstep, get hit by an X when your gap closes down, then Olaf is just going to run you down completely. Now some advice up against Olaf that I don't really see a lot of players punish hard is his Q. He is going to throw Qs onto you at times to try to hit you and the minions at the same time. When his Q is on cooldown, if it's far away, that is a great time to punish him. His Q is pretty much his whole kit. He needs to slow the damage, the cooldown reset, all of that. So if he tossed a Q at you and poked you, even if it hit you, if the Q is really far away from him, you can force a trade onto him. You could even Jax Q onto his head and bash him down. He's not going to be able to slow you or do anything back to you as long as you in that trade in CC, or maybe all in him before his axe comes back up. Making sure you see his Q is a massive cooldown to punish, because a lot of Olaf players will throw it for poke and leave themselves open to be punished. Now as for Kennen, the best melee counter pick to him is still going to to be Irelia, so much kill threat onto him, especially at level 6. Also later on in the game when you build Hullbreaker, really hard for him to play the mid game out also. Now some other options are champs like Vladimir, champs like Jayce, where not only can you farm for free, but if he ever tries to trade onto you, you're going to completely stomp him. These matchups can be quite weird where if you run at him and tank his Q in full combo, you'll lose the trade, but if he comes onto your side, you'll win. But it's not just a go even matchup. Champions like Jayce, especially level 5, level 7, when you get the AoE Shock Blast, high damage, hitting the wave, you can really start to chunk him. And because Kennen has no sustain, which is a big benefit of Vladimir over Kennen, any type of even trade is going to be good for you. Now for Rise, which is another great counter, your wave clear just makes it really hard for him to really do anything. Just keep shoving him in under tower, trying to poke him, and you have great gank setup as well with EW, and you hard outscale him in side lane also. Another special mention, I wouldn't say it's a hard counter, especially if the Kennen player is extremely good, but Cho'gath has a pretty good time into him, especially if you do the more movement speed build with 5 points in Q, just clear the wave, poke him, and especially if you have good Q accuracy, or he mispositions, you can hit him with Halo Blades, you can hard punish. Now you don't have to go Halo in that matchup. If you're not that confident, you can take Comet, more that ease of execution, but still pretty easy, I would say, for Cho'gath to go even, unless the Kennen is completely insane. Now, some advice for playing up against him is not only playing around his Q, using the wave to block it, trying to pre-dodge it, but also playing around his W. Make sure you left click him and check the top left corner when his W is on 3 or 4 stacks ready to use it, and if he just throws it at a minion or your tower, something like that, that can be a really good timer to go. Also making sure you try to punish his E cooldown if you can. If he uses E for a trade, making sure you're not letting him auto take you for free. If you have all your abilities up, you can hard punish him because that is his main stun. It's really hard for him to proc stun without his E in a hurry unless he has ulti and his main disengage tool as well. Next up we have Sylas, so another top laner with surprisingly high pick rate. And the best answers to him are champions like Darius, Garen, or Sett, especially if you take Ignite. You don't have to on Darius, but Garen and Sett you definitely should. And another option would be Volibear with Ignite, champions that can completely destroy him in the extended trade, and quite easy to force onto him. It's quite hard for Sylas to farm from far away, his Q's not that reliable, so if he ever walks up to farm, and you can just run him down on these strong, beefy bruiser champions, with Ignite to cut through that W healing, really hard for him to really do anything. Moving on to Singed, and the best answers to Singed are normally champions that can easily poke him down and kite him. So champs like Gnar or Jayce or even Gangplank can just keep chipping away at his HP bar, and really hard for him to really reach you and do anything if you have good spacing. Especially champ like Gnar, you can even blow up the tower in front of him if you're having a good game, especially with Swifty boots, really hard for him to do anything. Now Gangplank's not a super hard counter, anything like that, he might even proxy you, but you win the trades if you have good spacing, use your barrels well, and you get to farm for free, really important on that champion. Now Irelia is one of the better melees into her. Really easy for you to force onto him because you have so many dashes. If he flips you once, you still got your Q stack onto him from hitting your ulti or your E. Really easy to just stay onto him and keep bashing him down. So the number one rule for playing up against Singed is trying your best to stop him from proxying, because I've seen a lot of players let the wave come back into you, try to freeze it, and sometimes he just drops an entire wave and goes and proxies. So really important that you don't let that happen. You want to be trying to stack 2 waves together at a time, but don't really let it come all the way back to your side. It doesn't mean you can never freeze and punish, especially around level 4, it's not too bad. But later on in the game when he has Tattoo Boots, he's just going to proxy if you try to do that. So try to keep him pinned in lane if you can. Also making sure you really value high tempo recalls, because if you base after the Singed, he gets back to lane first, kills the wave, he's just going to proxy, and once the Singed is in that proxy position, getting them out by yourself is pretty much impossible, so the best approach is try to prevent them from proxying in the first place. Next up we have Kayle, and the best counterpicks to her are champions like Renekton, champs like Riven, where the way Kayle plays lane is kind of like a range champion in a way, where she just pokes you lower and lower with Q and enhance auto, and then all-ins you when you're low, but champs like Renekton and Riven can just brute force onto her and hard punish. Now Jayce can also chip away to get her lower and lower, and then all in her when she's low HP, so a really good matchup for Jayce also. A more niche counterpick is a champion like Zac. Most tanks actually do very well into a Kayle, as you can just build him up, and you just win the all-in most of the time, as long as you don't fight it to the death when Conqueror is stacking up. Just nice short trades, but Zac is especially good because you have way too much sustain, and really easy for you just to jump onto it and force advantages. Now some advice for playing up against a Kayle is making sure you build MR if possible. Not every champ can do it. For example, if you're Garen, you're probably not going to build MR as your first item, but a lot of champs can build Hex Drinker like Renekton, champs like Olaf. You can build Hex Drinker into her, or even just a Negatron Cloak or something like that if you're playing a tank. Making sure you're not egoing MR, because it goes a long way in the specific matchup. Now, making sure you try to roughly gauge her Q range can be good to go into practice tool for a little bit and figure out the exact max range of Q, because that's a great ability for you to bait out. Even her missing 1 or 2 Qs, it has a really high energy cost, and if she misses it, she'll have no way to regen it. So if you can bait even 1 Q out of her, and just dodge it the last second and then force onto it with your Jax Q, something like that, you can get a really good trade into her so early on into the lane. Now, she's also not that strong 1-5, so you want to be trying to get a lead if you can on most bruiser champions, like a Camille or something like that, where on Camille, the matchup's pretty much unplayable, level 6-9, but 1-5 is doable, so make sure you play a little bit aggressive and try to get a lead in that early portion of the lane. Moving on to Kled, and personally, I love when I see this guy blind picked on the enemy team, because most of my champ pool does very well into him. So champions like Fiora, champions like Jax or Camille have a very, very good time into him. Fiora, you've got your parry for his Q, of course. Jax E blocks most of his damage. Camille passive, really good into him. So on and so forth. And you outscale that champion in side lane as well. Granted, you're not behind. Tryndamere also has a pretty good time, as Kled doesn't really have sustain, and you're the sustain king, and you can even proxy on him later on as well. Now, some advice when playing up against Kled: not only do you want to be baiting out his Q, but making sure you're not put in a position where you're fighting him when he falls off his horse, and you have no CDs. So you need to be pre-planning in advance your trade, and making sure you know this trade will knock him off the horse. If I start clicking away instantly, it's going to be really hard for him to reach you, especially if you can trade onto him and hold onto a gap closer to disengage after. When he falls off, then wait for all your abilities to come back up, and then try to all in him when he's on the dismounted form. Also, you can keep tabs of his W. You can't really use his W by choice. If he hits a minion, gets a last hit, his W will go on cooldown. There's the 4 auto attack thing that goes really quick. So if you see it's on cooldown, there's going to be a higher chance that you can win the trade as well. Next, we have Malphite. So if you do versus the last Malphite player left after his build got nerfed, the best counter picks to him are going to be the Axe champions. Of course, he's a tree, so champs like Olaf, champs like Darius are going to be your best bet for cutting him down, or even a champion like Gangplank or Gwen, and mainly playing for free farm, because he can't really punish you in lane that well. He's a pretty good gang setup, but Gangplank, of course, you're going to need that orange, Olaf ulti, stuff like that, and Darius, you have a lot of 1v2 capabilities. Now, something to keep in mind versus champion, his main benefit is his amazing gang setup, so you want to be being very aware against the jungler. Don't tunnel too hard on trying to beat up that Malphite player. Be very aware of the jungler, be extra cautious than you normally would, because Malphite's CC is extremely high. Next up, we have Aurora. Now, the best melee answers to Aurora are going to be champs like Irelia, champs like Yasuo, or even Tryndamere. With Irelia and Yasuo having more kill threat, but Tryndamere, you're just a sustained king. You can stay in lane for a long time. You don't really get that bothered by her, and you can even proxy later on as well. Another answer is Ryze, really good at just keeping her stuck under tower, the whole lane, the whole mid game, and just ulting away whenever you get ganked. Really easy counter pick as long as you have enough Ryze mastery. Now, some advice for playing up against Aurora is going to be quite brutal if you're a champion with no gap closer. So make sure you abuse your Doran Shield, your second wind, and play for more so the resource game. Try to bait her to use abilities and waste her mana. When she's low on mana, really easy for you to play the game, so just don't take too much damage before she gets to that point. Try to pretend to go for a minion, bait her to use Q, stuff like that. Her Q range is quite long, for some reason they buffed it. Probably no one on the right balance team is versus Aurora top, but if you can bait her to use enough Qs or even her E as well, and she gets lower and lower on mana, then you can start to play the game a lot more. Most champions get annihilated by Aurora in top lane, to be honest, but later on when you've got one item, so Garen is a good example, the lane is unplayable, but at Stride Breaker, then it's really hard for her. So if you can get to one item and you're not too far behind, you are going to be fine on most top lane champions. It won't be the most fun journey getting to that item, but as long as you're trying to play around baiting her abilities, dodging them, staying high HP, baiting her mana, you're going to have a lot of a bit of time than just trying to brute force kill her on any bruiser. Next up, we have Cassiopeia. Now, this is one of those champions that just doesn't have a hard counter. The best picks into her are champions that can farm relatively safely. So a champion like Kennen or Gnar, even a champion like Rumble is decent because you can farm from range, and also you have some all-in options too. So if your jungler comes for a gank or you get some good trades, maybe you can do a 1v1, you're going to be in a good position. Because the problem with playing a normal melee into her is she can poke you down when you go for farm, and if you jump onto her head, she's going to win that extended trade, chase you down, abuse that movement speed and her conqueror. So it's pretty hard for you to win a full HP extended all-in on that bruiser, and getting her low HP can be quite difficult. So you mainly want to play to conserve HP. If you're a melee champion, play for gank setup, and if you can bait her to waste her Q or a little poo on the floor, the W, and then go for an all-in, that's going to be great. But her Q cooldown is so short, it's not as easy as bait her to use Q, punish her when it's down. You have to be constantly moving in an erratic way. The good thing is there's probably only 4 Cassiopeia players in the world that are good at hitting their Qs, so you should be fine for the most part. But those are just some options for counter picks. Now, another melee is of course going to be Irelia. You're probably sick of hearing her every time we see a ranged champion. She just has so much kill threat. She does pretty well into the majority of ranged top laners. Moving on to Urgot. So you have a couple of approaches playing up against him. The range option with Gnar being the best one, as you can win the lane and outscale him inside as well. Or you can just straight brute force it on champs like Darius, champs like Olaf, run him down and win that extended trade. Urgot normally wants short trades. He can take long in certain matchups, but champs like Darius and Olaf, really good extended trades, can make it really tricky for him. Sett's another good option as well. If you take Ignite, you can really just brute force speed him down. Now, the thing to keep in mind with Urgot, if you're playing a champion that's not that strong early game, he's one of the worst scaling champions in top lane. You do not have to get a big advantage up against him. So mainly play for good CS, try to poke him if you can, but don't try to overexert yourself trying to punish him early game if you're playing a champ that's not that strong during that 1-9 portion of the lane. Most champs can outscale them around level 9 with your first item, so you don't need to feel too pressured to play too aggressive early game if your champ's not that strong. And for our final champion, we have Varus. Now, hopefully, you never get unlucky enough to verse a Varus top, but some great answers to him are champions like Olaf, champs like Yasuo or Jax, because you have significant all-in threat against him. Now, you need not only all-in threat, but survivability, so Jax E, Olaf ulti to just cleanse the Varus ulti, and of course Yasuo being able to win wall his combo are going to be the best champions up against him. Now, an ease of execution, I wouldn't really call it a counter, but a pick would be Malphite, where you just poke him a few times with your common, and if your jungler likes you, you can make the Varus go 0-5. If he doesn't, you're probably still going to have a bad time, but that can be an easy way to play up against him. Now, some advice for versing Varus: if you are playing a normal top lane, they can't really beat him, even if you are playing one of the counters. His level 1 is really brutal. You need to use bush control quite well. You need to be very respectful of him during the early portions of the lane, and be very aware of what your jungler is doing. You don't want to take too much damage if you're on weak side, and if your jungler is coming towards you, you need to facilitate that and hold your abilities and be ready to play for that, because the number 1 weakness to Varus is of course going to be jungle ganks, so no matter what champion you're playing, it's something that you need to be really keeping in mind. But if your jungler is pathing down and you're playing a champion that can't all in him, then you're probably going to have a really miserable experience, but just try to get your item unscathed and beat him later on in the game, as he doesn't really function that well in the side lane either if he's not a hit. Alright team, that's it for now. Hope you enjoyed the video. Any support is greatly appreciated. But one more thing I'll say before we wrap it up: make sure you're still valuing your champ mastery as the number 1. Counterpicks can still be extremely important, especially ease of execution counters like a Malphite into Quinn, but make sure you're not tunneling too hard on them. You don't want to be first timing Irelia into Vlad just because I said it's a good matchup. You need that champ mastery to back it up. So I'll wrap it up here. I hope you enjoyed the video, and I'll see you all next time.